afternoon and welcome to another time out on Book Splash on Splash FM 105.5 Ibadan. Once again, let all book lovers converge here for another enriching moment. I am Michael Olatunbosun. Today, let's review a collection of poems. The work was published this year by Craft Books in Ibadan. It is titled Land of Tales, a collection of 57 poems written by Barth Akpah. The author, Barth Akpah, holds bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees in English from the University of Ibadan. He has taught English in various institutions both in Nigeria and Liberia. Bartholomew Akpah's works have been published in journals both in Nigeria and internationally. Land of Tales is his first collection. The work, Land of Tales, is an aggregation of the poet's burdens and experiences on his many travels across lands. The collection throws up the poet's perceptions about life, love, nationhood, morality, and unity. In the collection, for instance, the poet's ability to observe the world is mirrored in the words of this poem titled Caprice Ruptured. In the poem, the poet persona is held captive simultaneously between his desire for love, forgiveness, equality, and unity on the one hand, and his perception of bitterness and hatred on the other. Thus, in his attempt at making sense of the world, what he says is a world overtaken by confusion and hatred. In the poem titled Truth, the poet laments the loneliness of truth as a virtue in this world. For the poet, the world is filled with men and women who gleefully deal in half-truths and whose vocation is outright falsehood. The poet speaks to truth this way. Indeed, mortal's son, but why do men and women who fly your kite get docked and loathed, and those who abhor your charm enjoy princely latria? Why do men of all walks favor the other chick? Or was it not your virtues that are sermonized in the oracle of many at the sanctuary? And yet, you are like a punnet waiting endlessly for the water's overflow, yet the other chick's yurt is decorated. Even those who scrunch atop our destinies amble not in your light. Only a few choose your passio, while many seek you in half measures. Oh, I do not wish to say you lie catnapping as your seeds are grown, but to termites slop. In this poem, and indeed for the poet, the purveyors of truth are criminalized, and immunity is conferred on the merchants of falsehood. Even the sermons in the sanctuaries are laced with lies. You're still listening to Book Splash on Splash FM 105.5 Ibadan. The book on the table is a collection of poems titled Land of Tales, written by Barth Akpah. In this collection, the poet gleefully takes a dive into the depths of words and resurfaces in splendor with fiery lashes for the political elite in the land. In the poem, Words and Opposites, the poet persona takes a sarcastic swipe at the promise-failing looting lot who run our political space. The poet here sharpens his axe and cuts away the veils of deceit with which the political class veil election time promises. He says they deliver nothing and concludes that speaking from both sides of their mouths is their expertise. In this collection, Land of Tales, Barth Akpah also has a song for Gaddafi. The song is a dirge on the bloodshed on the road which the Libyan strongman Muammar Gaddafi tread on his sinister plans of perpetuating himself in power. Still on politics and the political class, the poet calls upon the imagery of royalty to speak about the dead deafness of the scepter to the cries and calls and agitations of the people of the land. In the poem Weep Not, Dashed, the poet laments thus: Weep not, my son, for the scepter is aloof to your cries, blind to your tears, dumb to your lamentations, dead to your dreams. Weep not, my son, for the scepter sees no life in your breath, silent to the tailspin of your dreams, calm to the hunger gnawing your belly, benumbed to the bleak sun ray. Weep not, my son, for the scepter is deaf to raging agitations, deaf to the dissonant throbbing of our hearts, still to your future's pains, lame to your pain's songs. In this dirge, the poet persona regrets that the king is dead to the helpless call for help by the weeping child. Thus, that his hunger needs to be assuaged, that his future needs to be secured, and that his agitation needs to be addressed. You're still listening to Book Splash on Splash FM. We're discussing Barth Akpah's Land of Tales. In the first part of my conversation with Dr. Barth Akpah, we learn of his motivation for this collection, its title, the structure and arrangement of the collection, and its influences. Listen, the title of your collection is Land of Tales. What occasioned this title?
It connotes quite a lot of things. First, when you look at our land, our environment, the space which accommodates every human being on earth, you realize that this space is such that is filled with a lot of stories, a lot of events, activities, which to me come in forms of tales. And having lived in this country for quite a number of years, and my travels to other countries within Africa, I realized that this space, this land, is such that comes with burden of tales. And this is what actually informed the title of the collection.
So I'd like you to tell me, in specific terms, what occasioned the book?
To start with, how do we see poetry? Or how do we see imaginative writing? When you write as a writer, you write to reflect the realities that you have around you. Now, in this space of ours, there are a lot of such realities, which may be a kind of a burden, which may be a kind of private issues, or perhaps love. And all these joined together, I must tell you, can be found in this collection. Realities that reflect life within our society. Realities that reflect our moral rectitude. Realities that also reflect how we interact with one another as a social being.
Interesting. Okay, so let me just go to this one. This poem called Caprice Ruptured. The poet persona is torn or held captive simultaneously between his desire for love, forgiveness, mercy, equality, and unity, and blind, bitter hatred. So in his search for a sane world of unity, he is confronted by a world of confused hatred. That is the poet persona in this work. That is you. That is your perception of the world. You think that we will be able to find a saner world today?
Well, that is a question that is left for everyone to answer. But then, despite all this, I still feel that there must be a remedy, despite the fact that our world is ruptured. Because what you see in that poem is that you have a reflection of some of these inconsistencies in our country, specifically our country, Nigeria. And so when you look at the reflection of this poem, or when you look at the voice of the poet persona, you realize that what the poet does here is to chronicle some of these events that actually affect us as citizens of the world, not just as the country Nigeria. And then towards the end of the poem, you also see that the poet speaks to the elusiveness of unity in our society.
Okay.
And so what you have there is the irony that brings us together as individuals.
I find quite a number of poems interesting here. But before I go there, I want to ask about why you chose to structure your work this way. The poem I was making reference to, Caprice Ruptured, it looks like it's a poem broken into two, where you have something similar to those features of the Anglo-Saxon poetry in your work. I know that you are a scholar. You even hold a PhD in English. So I'd like to ask you, what occasioned the structure of your work? A lot of poems in your work are like that, like split into two. In the first part and the second part, they still make sense when joined together or when read separately.
What you see in those poems that you actually alluded to can be considered as emblematic
Okay.
of concrete poetry, if,
All right.
if you like. However, in my own case, I tried to actually invent a new form of such emblematic poetry. And what you see, or what you observe in those poems, is that besides the fact that the structure of the poems can actually help you to derive meanings from the poem, I also want the reader to actually see another poem from the same
poem.
In other words, if you are reading it from this side, you have your meaning. If you move towards the other end, you can derive another meaning. Now, this other side of the poem can actually give you a kind of the summary of what this poem is all about. For instance, if you look at this poem, Captured Caprice, I want to write haiku about Saul named Paul. But the road to Damascus seeks my blindness. I want to make a chalet for love, but it may braid melodies of hate. I want to sing a cappella for forgiveness, but the vengeance in me dancing skulkery. I want to write a poem about mercy, but my heart tore my kindness apart. Now, this is just a stanza. If you move towards the other end, you have it captured as ruptured. Now, Saul named Paul seeks my blindness. A chalet for love, braid melodies of hate. A cappella for forgiveness, dances kunkere. And so what you have here is that you just to help the reader. So, okay, this is just a summary of what this part is talking about.
Yes.
And besides that, of course, you know that the work of art, poetry specifically, is such that can yield meanings in different ways. And so you can derive a lot of meanings from this poem, but from the perspective of the writer, just like we have in the novel, where you have story weaved within a story. And this is also what I tried doing in the same poem, how we can also weave a poem within a poem. So it's just a kind of invention on my part. Well, I might not say that probably this is totally new, because I don't want to take it for granted that nobody else has
done this before.
Okay? But I just believe that we need to experiment. We need to also redirect the attention of our readers towards how they can actually appreciate poetry. Not just by the way it is written, but also by the way it is structured.
That means that you are a protest poet, right? You want a deviation from the norm, right?
Definitely. Not that I want a deviation from the norm, but as a writer, as a poet, sometimes you just have to come with uncommon forms, that we actually attract the attention of the reader.
I am discussing the collection of poems, Land of Tales, written by Barth Akpah. A moment about you. Tell me, when did you stumble upon writing? How did it start for you?
To start with, I never thought of writing poetry as a career. I never see poetry as something I could actually write and make my living out of it.
Okay.
I feel that for you to be a good writer, you should just put the aspect of earning a living from it and then write such that you know that, okay, you are doing this for the sake of what you love. Specifically, I think in the year 2001, that was the first time I thought of writing a poem. And my first poem, I think it was written around that time. It was Captured Child Abuse. And that poem was actually submitted for a poetry contest in BBC Africa, as well as Voice of America. Of course, it was later published in The Punch. But then what actually informed my inroad into poetry? And it's just because I feel that, of course, you should know that every human being on earth is a poet.
In some way, somehow.
Somehow. But I just discovered that activities around me are quite poetic. And I don't really have that luxury of time to say, okay, I want to sit down and begin to write it in form of a story. Of course, you know that the language of poetry, just like Eni Oshundare stated, that it's like the dried meat that fills the mouth. So a line can actually mean a lot of things. So I just feel that, okay, if I have like 4, 5, 6, 10, 14 lines, that should be enough to capture all these poetic events around me. And so I thought of writing a poem that time. But immediately after that, I abandoned poetry, especially when I gained admission into the University of Ibadan. I joined the press club there in the University of Ibadan, and I was much more concerned with tales happening within the university environment. But then later, I just discovered that same muse, poetry, kept knocking. That Barth, you need to write. And then I started writing again. And that is the story that has brought me to where I am today.
Who are your influences? You mentioned Niyi Oshundari, so you could just add other poets or other writers to the list. You mentioned Niyi Oshundari, and I've seen, fingers of Oshundari in your work. I believe I have seen fingers of Wole Soyinka in your work. I know I've seen even Remi Raji in your work. I see all these people in you. Am I correct?
Well, you are correct. Besides these iconic names which you have mentioned, I must also tell you that those who influence poetry might not necessarily be those big names that you drop. The market women, that roadside seller, can influence your writing. However, when it has to do with learning the trade, the act of writing itself, we cannot but appreciate the role played by the ancestors. And one of such ancestors, like you rightly pointed out, is Niyi Oshundari. But even before him, even before I gained admission into the university, I had also come across other poets which we read in secondary school then. The likes of course, you have mentioned Wole Soyinka, J.P. Clark,
Gabriel
Okara. And then those from other climes. Shakespeare, Pablo Neruda. Wow. We cannot mention them all. But then, as a student in the university, sometimes when you go to class and you look at your lecturers when they stand before you, and then you have their works with you, they are just enough to inspire you to write. And so when you have the likes of Professor Remi Raji, the likes of Nelson Fashinod, of course, Professor Ademola Da Silva.
Yes.
And a couple of other big names, definitely you have no choice but to also want to strive to be like them.
You're still listening to Book Splash on Splash FM Ibadan. In this collection, the poet perpetually sings about the land and celebrates his non-existent unity in this poem about the beautiful contradictions. The poet muses on this contrasting sense, then concludes that, I quote, "I have a country whose credo is, there was a country." End of quote. In the collection Land of Tales, Barth Akpah also has poems on nature, love and living. These poems are all packed full of scintillating sights and sounds, all touching the very veins of the reader in their musical majesty. Throughout the collection's 4 main divisions, the poet playfully throws up rustic imagery to bring the reader close to nature. In this review, titled Dreams, Despairs of Nationhood in Barth Akpah's Land of Tales, published in The Guardian of 15 September, Stephen Keke writes of the work, I quote, "It is lucid to conclude that Akpah's Land of Tales is an embodiment of stories of self and nationhood. The tales that pervade the poems are wishes and wills, hope and horror. Above all, the images appropriated in the poems are realistically convincing, as they reasonably adhere to objective reality. I completely agree and add that this collection is a beautiful work of art and that the poet is a reader's delight." In the concluding part of my conversation with Barth Akpah, we examine his writing process as well as his thoughts on the political class and admonition for the electorate. Let me go to your writing process. What are your rituals, for instance?
First, I want to say, to start the writing itself, there must be something that will poke you.
Yes.
To activate your interest in the writing.
Okay.
Just as I was coming, I was on a bike, and as the bike man was riding. All of a sudden, he made some kind of gestures, trying to greet someone. And then I told him, why? Why that? You know you are driving, and then you are using one hand and the other hand waving at somebody, and we almost had an accident. But this is poetical. Now, if you look at our space, the society that we exist, there are a lot of things that are enough to motivate one into writing. Now, once you have that, the first thing is, how do you arrange your thoughts? How do you arrange it in metrical form? That's the first process.
Yes.
Now, you may have a rough sketch. There you go, and then you begin to write. That's the first process. Then after that comes the period or the moment of meditation, because there are some other external factors that may be accountable or that can actually
come into play.
Yes,
to really flesh the words,
really polish it and give it more vibe. Now, having done that, sometimes this thing also comes by a means of divine intervention.
Okay.
Sometimes when I want to write, probably in my dream, I could just dream about something.
Okay.
Those words would flash in. If I'm lucky to wake up that time, I scribble it down. And once I'm able to write it down, then I begin the meditation process and see how I can actually begin to arrange the words in their proper order.
How long did it take you to put this work together?
There is a poem in this collection that was written as far back as 2002.
That's 17 years now.
2002.
Wow.
But there are a couple of other poems that actually were written 3 years ago. So to say that this was the time, one might not be specific with respect to that. You know, I just told you that one of the poems here was written as far back as 17 years ago.
Okay, so what you did was,
however,
in between,
the process of starting to write it as a collection,
yes,
that period that I feel that, okay, I need to get this together as a collection, I think it started just 5 years ago.
Let me return to your work. The title of this poem is Your Cast. You wrote, before you cast, sieve your past and sign their days. Play the old lyrics of classical roulettes and cross their thoughts in present, past, and past principles in chapters of time. Before you cast, cross their deeds of sudden mansions and their honeypots. Seek their motions and unravel their mysteries. Before you cast, follow not their tawdry marbles on caressing lips and clappers of piercing rhetorics on mansions of burning cheese. Before you cast, flee from vampire thirst. Return their smiles and dimple gaze with suspense and missions and cast them out in the booth of destinies. You must have a big axe to grind with the political class.
Definitely.
Tell me about this. What's your perception of the political class?
This is an obvious fact that I believe everybody or anyone who is conscious of our political happenings in Nigeria should know. Not just in Nigeria, because this collection is not specifically tied to Nigeria as a country. But when you look at politicians generally, particularly during the period of election, you realize that these are individuals that will come out with a lot of promises. Some will show themselves in angelic forms. And so it is the duty of the electorate to sieve, to look at them critically. Because what we have seen so far has not demonstrated the fact that the political class has been able to live up to their words. Otherwise, we cannot be where we are today as a nation. And that is why this poem is like a clarion call to the electorate. A kind of the poet trying to admonish the electorate that before you go to that booth of destinies, because the politician is such a powerful individual that can make admire you. And so, like somebody said, that the president of a country is such that is bigger than any god, because he can control your living. Just imagine that our dear president makes a pronouncement that every civil servant working in this country deserves to be paid 200,000 naira. That can change the destiny of someone. On the other hand, the political class can also come up with a policy that can stifle the individual in the society. And so, it behoves on the electorate to shine
their eyes
so that they will be able to make the right decision, particularly during the election period.
You have poems addressed to the president, poems that address the political class and the rest of it in your work. I observe a particular poem. It's about soca. What is the attraction with soca in your collection?
That poem was written when we had the case of kidnapping. Of course, we still have it now, but remember that there was this case of soca experience in Ibadan. And so at that period, I just feel that I think I need to write something to depict the atrocity of the events surrounding that soca experience. And that is what you have in this poem. The unknown evil forest, the holocaust of man's heart, with weakened haste, you thumb mortal flesh and sip fellow bloods in dark corners of mafia lords. Evil careers to the end, in white chase at noon, the morning breath of terrors, the red deeds at night falls, a syndicate to master's cause, blindness colored the heart, in vain quest of tasteless loaves, of choking comforts, and terror taste of shallow treasures. Darkness sees your souls in the dungeon of festering hearts, of poisoned deeds and buried scruples held spellbound to fated men in man's den. Soca. That experience, particularly that time, is such that as human, you definitely be filled with goose pimples, that your fellow human being can go to such extent of terminating one's fellow life for the sake of making money or for the sake of ritual.
This was published in 2019. Any other thing in the pipeline?
Definitely. There are, even after I had published this, there are other poems that I have written. There are some that will still be written.
Okay.
But I can assure you that in the next 2 years, my reader should expect another collection. I also set my eyes in the other genres of literature, probably a prose work. But this is just a starting point. And I believe that once you start writing, definitely as a writer, you just have to continue to reflect on the realities within your society. Because the people have to see the society through your art. And we cannot keep quiet. As a public intellectual, we cannot feign blindness to events happening around us. We must continue to write them. We must continue to document them. We must continue to explore them so that our leaders will be aware that, yes, there are certain individuals whose eyes are set on events happening in the society.
But how would you describe yourself as a poet?
Barth, as a poet, is someone who is very much interested in documenting societal realities and also using art to reflect the inner thoughts.
Barth Akpah, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, sir.
I hope you enjoyed this edition of Book Splash on Splash FM. If you did, please join me for another edition of the program next Saturday, same time. I thank you for listening. Thanks to my sound manager, Victor Daudu, for a job well done. I can be reached for comments and queries by SMS on 0805 699 8676 or email Olatunbosun at splashfm1055.com. Follow me on Twitter at Mike Tumbosun. I am Michael Olatunbosun, and I urge you to read the book today.